From the European Parliament in Brussels, this is Raw Politics. Thank you for joining us tonight, and this is what we have on the program. Sharm offensive. As EU and Arab leaders sit down in Egypt, we ask, is Europe selling out on human rights? Cutting it close. UK Prime Minister Theresa May pushes Brexit to the brink by delaying a critical vote. Romania unrest. Another big protest and fresh concerns the EU is fighting a losing battle against corruption. Days number the American threat against Venezuela amid deadly clashes and military defections. And a pool party. Theresa May shoots some stick and entertains the internet in tonight's Raw Moment. Well, it is time to meet our panelists this evening. We have Ryan Heath. He is a political editor at Politico Europe. Ryan, which of these stories are you watching?
I'm going with Venezuela.
Right.
I think that's the most serious one, and I think his days are numbered.
Big story over the weekend, especially. And also joining us, Sajid Karim. He's a British MEP with the European Conservatives and Reformists. So what about you, Sajid?
Well, it's the titbit on the pool party. I mean, what do you do if the Italian PM invites you to a pool party? You panic, of course, and that's exactly what the poor girl did.
I know, it's really awkward. Anyway, you'll see it later. And also joining us tonight, Stephen Wolfe. He's a non-attached British MEP. Now, Stephen, which of these stories are you watching?
I've got to go for the Sharm offensive because here we are trying to do deals and talk in a place with people who are corrupt and are cruel to their own people. Should we be doing that?
A lot happening over there, in fact, and that is exactly where we are beginning tonight, because world leaders are meeting in the Egyptian resort of Sharm el-Sheikh today for the first ever EU-Arab League summit. Now, Egypt's President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi greeted arriving leaders yesterday. Migration, security, and the Middle East peace process are on the agenda, but the timing is awkward, to say the least. Now, just last week, 9 Egyptians accused of killing the country's chief prosecutor were executed, a move condemned by human rights groups amid claims the men were beaten and tortured until they confessed. Meanwhile, Egyptian lawmakers are pushing to change the country's constitution to enable Sisi to stay in power until 2034. All right, for more on the summit, I'm joined now from Sharm el-Sheikh by our political editor, Darren McCaffrey. Darren, good to see you there. So, you know, this is front and center. Are European leaders actually sensitive to the claims that they are turning a blind eye to human rights abuses?
Yeah, good evening, Tessa, from the Egyptian desert. I think they are very aware of the allegations of human rights abuse and indeed the lack of democracy in this part of the world. But as Donald Tusk, the EU Council President, put it this evening at a press conference, the Arab League and the EU need to get real about their relations. He thinks that, yes, while there is much that divides them, ultimately they do share an awful lot of challenges, and thus cooperation must be the only way forward. Or as Jean-Claude Juncker put it, that he said if he was only to deal with flawless democracies, essentially his working week would end on a Tuesday. So I think there is a sense of realism and pragmatism about the EU's politics with all of this, not least of all, of course, when it comes to that vexed and very controversial issue of migration. The European Union knows that it needs the help of Arab states and indeed of African states if it is going to be able to try and manage migration into Europe over the years and decades to come. But as I say, that is not to say that they are aware and sensitive to the issues of human rights and democracy in this part of the world. And that's something clearly Donald Tusk alluded to when he was asked that very specific question a little bit earlier.
Never, under no circumstances, will I give up on freedom and democracy. And that is why I insisted that our summit declaration should include our commitment, common commitment, from both sides, to the upholding of all aspects of international human rights law. And I am absolutely convinced, my whole life experience tells me that in this very context, dialogue is always much better than confrontation.
Now, it must be noted that when President Sisi was asked that question, he essentially simply refused to answer it. Now, it must be said that for many, this simply is not good enough, that Europe has tried to portray itself as a beacon of liberalism, of human rights, of freedom, of openness and democracy to the rest of the world, particularly, obviously, in contrast to Donald Trump, who has, in many regards, befriended so-called dictators across the world. And so many will be disappointed by the European Union's actions. It must be said, though, that they have taken that into account slightly. Of course, Bashar al-Assad is not here. The Sudanese president is not here. And there has been criticism, not least of all of the hosts, Egypt, during this summit. But be in no doubt, Europe very much is taking a pragmatic approach to these Middle East strongmen, let me put it like that, and that they feel that cooperation has to be the way forward if they are to tackle what they call those common challenges of security, terrorism and migration.
All right, for the moment, thanks for that, Darren McCaffrey. We'll be going back to you in just a few moments. But first, let's talk about this issue. Okay, Stephen, you brought it up earlier. Yep. Is this turning a blind eye? And it's more than just that, isn't it? You're sharing a platform. You're bringing publicity to this country, to this leader. Is it more than just turning a blind eye?
No, it's legitimizing brutality of a brutal dictator in his own country. You've got to remember who this man was. He was part of the military complex that was in Egypt that was brought into power after the revolution, where the revolutionaries, young people all over, who thought they were going to get democracy. And what did they do? The leadership, a leadership we may not have liked in terms of the Brotherhood, were actually pushed aside, and thousands of them are currently in prison on death row. This is a leader that's imprisoned people who are journalists, just like Ryan here, for opposing him. This is a leader that's ignored a lot of the crimes against the Coptic Christians who've been killed up and down the country by violent terrorists within their own country.
But there's two things that we're weighing here, because leaders are no strangers to working with governments they don't like.
Sure.
or have problems with. And right now, Europe has a big problem with migration, security, and terrorism, which they have to work with these countries. So is there, when you weigh these two together, is there a compromise to be made?
Well, there's no problem with pragmatism, but you need a real strategy. What's the end game with Saudi Arabia, for example, would be my point. You have people like the French Finance Minister Bruno Le Maire yesterday complaining that Germany was getting in his way of selling arms exports to Saudi Arabia. Well, humanitarian disaster in Yemen, Khashoggi killing, the general misogyny of the country. Yep. I mean, maybe there should be obligations and complications if you want to sell arms to Saudi Arabia. So I would want to see the EU doing a little bit more in terms of just running to Arab states when it needs help on migration, but having a real plan of how it's going to make these compromises.
I mean, that's a good point you make, because I think it seems like EU countries or countries in general, are walking on eggshells when it comes to business partners. Maybe that's not mutually exclusive. Maybe you can be firm on human rights demands and do business with someone. Is that even a possibility?
Well, these are all very fair points that have been made. And it is a question of balance here. We have to, of course, deal with the world as we find it. It's never going to be a perfect place. And occasionally, ever so occasionally, you do find yourself having to sit across the table from somebody that you fundamentally disagree with on a number of things, including, of course, dictators at times as well. Personally, on a point of balance, would I have gone with this particular summit? Yes, I would. And the reason for that is this, that unless we are prepared to carry out an extensive exercise of dialogue that brings the Arab nations to the table, and the only way in which that could happen on a collective basis is through a summit of this sort, then we simply are not going to be in a position to carry out any follow-up dialogue.
That's exactly what Sisi was saying. He said he prefers dialogue to confrontation, but isn't it legitimizing a government like his?
Well, it's a question of balance, because we have to be very, very careful that at all times we never, ever allow this summit to give the impression that we are OK with many of the things that are happening there. And Stephen's pointed some of those out. I completely endorse those. And that's why it was right that Donald Tusk and every other leader that has spoken, every national leader that's present from Europe, has put down a marker when it's come to some of these actions.
But my concern about it is the double standards. What difference is it between what Sisi was doing and what was happening in Syria? If we negotiated with Syria, we wouldn't have had a war, and we wouldn't have had the millions of people that have left that country to go towards Europe on the migration in the first place. Therefore, we could have been tougher with Egypt at the time. Here we are, having some members of the parliament, not all, I admit, wanting to have negotiations with those in Venezuela or the leaderships there in Maduro. You know, again, we're picking and choosing. I think the common factor that Ryan was talking about is, whilst you're right, We do have to deal sometimes with unpleasant people. I've agreed with that. We should have dealt with the unpleasant person of Syria. But you have to have a common thread of equality between them. And at the moment, I think there are those in the Middle East who think we can get away with it because there is a particular reason vis-a-vis Turkey, because we know that we need to stop the migration coming in for elections in Europe, and Sisi's doing the same.
But isn't that, yes, the point is, are we picking and choosing strong men to be friends with? But at the same time, isn't it also in the national interest of the EU? They want to solve the migration crisis. They're not hiding this fact.
That's right, but the EU's had 6 years, 7 years since the start of the Arab Spring. There were great plans announced under Catherine Ashton, which I don't really see coming to fruition. We talked at the Valletta Summit about special funds that were going to help solve the problem in Africa itself before people ever tried to risk their lives through people smugglers or dodgy boats to get to Europe. And I'm not sure that we're seeing the follow-through on all of those ideas. What I would criticize the EU for is not developing and sticking to a full strategy. It's tactics rather than strategy.
But Ryan, we have to remember the domestic situation in these countries as well. I was part of Catherine Ashton's first action task force that went across to Egypt when Morsi was president. And at that time, we made it abundantly clear to the Liberals who were actually boxing Morsi into a corner that unless you give him the space that he needs and support some of the programs that he's putting forward, you're going to find yourselves in a very difficult situation. But the Liberals were not willing to move from their very concrete positions. And that's why we then found ourselves in a situation where the economy was beginning to collapse. And in the end, we find ourselves where we are. So don't forget that the local domestic dynamics at play here. It's not all about
what
we can control.
But are we delivering the money at that more grassroots level or to the organisations that can actually support humanitarian efforts in these countries? But I don't feel like the money's getting there at all. Right. Yeah, I think the money's not getting there in the way that it was planned and imagined 6 or 7 years ago. And I think that's a problem. I
mean, again, so I think the point that we come up with is that there needs to be a balance between such, very, weighing the options, very sensitive parts of the equation. All right, that is not the only topic talked about in Sharm el-Sheikh, a big story that we're also following there, because Theresa May was there, and she might have flown all the way to North Africa, but it wasn't far enough to escape. What else? Brexit. First, EU Council President Donald Tusk threw his support behind a Brexit extension to avoid a chaotic no deal. While in another press conference a few minutes later, Theresa May ruled out an extension, saying it wouldn't deliver but simply delay. Let's go back to Egypt, to Darren McCaffrey. Darren, okay, there's not much consensus. Something is said one minute, another thing is said the other. Can you bring us some clarity?
Well, it's not just you that's been trying to get away from Brexit. I've travelled thousands of miles to another continent and have ended up talking yet again about Brexit. It has managed to dominate this summit somewhat, at least the headlines. As you say, we've got to the stage where I think people are starting to talk about what has seemed very, very likely for a long period of time. That is that Article 50 may well be extended beyond March 29th of this year. Donald Tusk suggesting it was now the rational way forward because there was not agreement in the House of Commons about what the alternatives could be and that no deal needed to be avoided. And on top of that, Theresa May, who has been pretty busy over the last 24 hours or so with a whole series of bilateral meetings with not just Donald Tusk yesterday, but also Jean-Claude Juncker, with Chancellor Merkel, Prime Minister Rutte, and the Irish Taoiseach as well, essentially is not that keen on delaying Article 50. Now, she may well end up having to do it, but she argues that delay simply means delay. Let's have a listen to both of them speaking to the press in the last couple of hours.
The less time there is until the 29th of March, the greater is the likelihood of an extension. And this is an objective fact, not our intention, not our plan, but an objective fact. I believe that in the situation we are in, an extension would be a rational solution. But Prime Minister May still believes that she's able to avoid this scenario.
An extension to Article 50, a delay in this process, doesn't deliver a decision in Parliament. It doesn't deliver a deal. What it does is precisely what the word delay says. It just delays the point at which we come to that decision. And I think that any extension of Article 50, in that sense, isn't addressing the issues.
So are Donald Tusk and Theresa May really on different pages? Well, they may see them in public, but I'm not entirely sure they are when it comes to a strategy here. I think that given the fact that Theresa May has now postponed her meaningful vote to the middle of March, she is hoping that she will be able to go to Parliament in a couple of weeks and essentially say that Europe have given some ground on this, potentially not the withdrawal agreement, but given some legal guarantees on the temporary nature of the backstop, in the hope that that may well get through Parliament ahead of the EU Council summit in the 20th, 21st of March, in the hope that that will then be green lit by the EU leaders. In saying that, clearly if that strategy fails, or the alternative for her could be asking MPs that if they decide to vote down her deal, then essentially they will be voting for a very long extension to Article 50. And that is where the European Union strategy of almost accepting that comes into play. Now, how long that extension is for, well, that gets even more complicated given the fact there are EU elections at the end of May, and Britain, in reality, would have to take part in them if the extension went beyond that period. So it's still very complicated, but there is a strategy here essentially of both the European Union and I think Theresa May hoping that in the middle of March, faced with a big extension to Article 50, ruling out no deal, and with her deal still on the table, that MPs may actually, in the end, accept her deal. It's a gamble, it's a risk. It might not work, but that's currently, I think, the thinking from both sides, from Brussels and from London.
All right, thanks for that, Darren McCaffrey, our political editor. And joining me now in the studio to discuss this is Richard Corbett, a British MEP sitting with the Socialists and Democrats. All right, Richard, Brexit means Brexit, Brexit means delay, now delay means delay. What does the delay actually mean now?
Well, these profound insights from Theresa May don't actually help us very much, but we're in a situation. Forget all the parliamentary procedures and shenanigans in Westminster. Get back to the fundamentals. Majority doesn't want to leave without a deal, because that's a catastrophic scenario. Parliament's already rejected the one deal on the table, May's deal. She might come back with a fig leaf to it on the backstop, but that's far from being the main problem with her deal, actually. I don't think it will persuade enough MPs to vote for it, so it will not carry. So if you don't want to leave without a deal, you don't want the only deal on the table, where do you go? There's only two possibilities: an alternative deal or changing your mind about Brexit. An alternative deal, Labour's put one on the table. Theresa May, shows no sign of pivoting in that direction. So if an alternative doesn't emerge, the one thing left is to stop Brexit. Legally dead easy,
Right.
Politically a bit more of a challenge. You would need a referendum.
But at the end, I mean, what she's trying to do is get MPs to vote on it. And she, as Darren was saying, she is trying to take a gamble. It may or may not work. Guy Verhofstadt said that what she's doing is absolutely reckless. But what do you think? Is she being reckless, or she's
a total hypocrite. Like, Theresa May does not have a problem with a delay. She just has a problem with other people being involved in steering this Brexit process. She just delayed the vote that was going to happen this week for another 2 weeks. So she's perfectly happy to delay things when it suits her. But she is very reluctant to let anyone, whether it's the Scottish government, the Labour opposition, or anyone else in the process, help try and steer this thing off the rocks. And I think that is the big problem here. Theresa May is no longer seen as reliable and reasonable by a lot of people in Brussels.
But when she does that...
I think she was compared to Boris Johnson, honestly. She was seen as a really safe pair of hands, and I just don't think that patience.
But you see, when you say
anymore.
something like she agrees to something when it works to her favour, is that being strategic or is that being desperate?
I think what was interesting for me over this weekend was seeing the Prime Minister Theresa May go and appear before very senior members of the Conservative Party. And if you actually consider the final resolution that was passed at that gathering, it actually says that Brexit should not be delayed beyond the 28th of May. Now, this is very interesting and very telling, because then, well, if you look at what the membership has put, I suspect, with the blessing of Downing Street in that resolution, the rest of what we're seeing playing out here starts to make some more sense.
All right, so what is the most likely now? I mean, you were laughing, you know, looking at, hearing what she had to say. What is the most likely
I've honestly given up making predictions, but either she bullies people into accepting this deal or there's a short delay. I don't see it being viable.
You don't think it's beyond the elections, for example?
No, and she's correct about that. That's really just kicking it pointlessly down the road. But if 6 to 8 weeks allows some resolution, then why not try it?
Even if that is the plan, is that the most logical plan now? Just kick the can. I mean, she's your.
Or you could kick
the can
Theresa
down
May
the road.
out of the road. Like if she wasn't the leader, then maybe there might be some different traction.
Well, she already holds the world record for kicking the can down the road, but at the moment she's kicking it down a road which is a dead end. So we'll see. But remember, even if she did get her deal through in 3 weeks' time, she's not left herself any time to get the legislation through. There would need to be a technical delay to Brexit even then. So that's why people find it absolutely astonishing that she keeps on saying, no, we'll leave on the 29th of March, come what may.
Yeah.
It beggars belief.
Well, for now, delay means delay. All right, to leave it at that for now. Now, two leaders heading for talks on neutral ground in a bid to break a long-running deadlock. No, it's not Theresa May and Jean-Claude Juncker's Brexit huddle in Sharm el-Sheikh this time, but it is actually Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un's summit in Vietnam. Let's take a look. Ever had a send-off quite like this? Smiles and waves from North Korea's Kim Jong-un as he departs Pyongyang on his way to Hanoi for talks with U.S. President Donald Trump. And as he settles in for the 2-day journey to Vietnam, this is thought to be his train crossing into China. Mr. Trump set the tone for the meeting.
He has a chance to have a country that is so vibrant economically, maybe one of the most in the world. But you can't do that if you're going to keep nuclear. If you do nuclear, that can't ever happen.
Meanwhile, in Vietnam, Kim and Trump's lookalikes are gearing up for a busy few days.
And Mr. Kim Jong-un, please fix your haircut. It's awful, okay?
But things didn't quite go to plan. The comedian who impersonates the North Koreans said authorities were deporting him from Vietnam some 24 hours before the real Kim's arrival.
The thing is that he's staying and I'm going. Yeah, North Koreans have no sense of humor.
First of all, Ryan actually thought they were the real guys.
I did.
Real Kim and real Trump. All right, what I would like to ask is, who wants to take a guess at what is Trump's endgame here?
A guess at Trump? My goodness, now you really are asking. I mean, how does the man's mind work? I think, as always, it's about showmanship and far less about substance. And providing he can have something, he doesn't really care what it is, he will exaggerate what he has got and he will present it to a domestic audience. And that's the only audience he really cares about back in the USA.
So, right, is it all about optics?
Yes, but about being crazier than the already unstable North Korean leader. And that's how Trump wins all of his fights, is he gets everyone distracted, he makes everyone confused, and then he hopes that he hasn't messed up his own thinking enough, and then he tries to sail through.
Well, there you go. It could be the strategy. All right, coming up on Raw Politics for you, schooling Theresa May, how Italian Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte taught his British counterpart a valuable life skill in Sharm el-Sheikh. Plus, Nicolas Maduro's days numbered. It depends whom you ask. We'll dive into the information wars that paint two very different pictures of a country in crisis. Welcome back to Raw Politics. Now, deadly clashes broke out in Venezuela over the weekend as President Nicolas Maduro blocked humanitarian aid from entering the country. Protesters and forces loyal to Maduro clashed across border towns, and rights groups said 4 people, including a 14-year-old boy, were shot dead. Hundreds more were injured. Meanwhile, at least 60 soldiers abandoned their posts, with some pledging allegiance to opposition leader Juan Guaido. Here's what one of the soldiers had to say after seeking asylum in Brazil.
Ya no queríamos en realidad estar apoyando, pues, ¿me entiendes? Lo que está sucediendo. Entonces decidimos venir y estar con lo del nuestro nuevo presidente Juan Guaidó y queremos también tener enlace con él. Nosotros nos venimos por nuestra propia voluntad.
And joining me in the studio to discuss this is Nelson Dordelli Rosales. He's a Venezuelan and the head of the International Law Department at the VUB. And we are also joined by Beatriz Rios, a reporter with Euractiv, and British MEP with the Greens, Molly Scott Cato. All right, first of all, in Venezuela, the military it plays such a crucial role. During Hugo Chavez's time, I think they were playing a role in social development. So the civilian and military were very much joined. This is why they're playing such an important role. For as long as the military supports Maduro, is there nothing that will change in Venezuela? I'd like to ask you first.
Yes, there is no. We need the military to actually change sides. And the problem with the military is that they are so much compromised because they have been involved in drug cartels, they have been involved in smuggling from Colombia, from Brazil, smuggling drugs. So there's really difficulty to actually convince them to turn sides and then support.
But those who would support them would probably see another side, that they are actually helping with the developments of society. I mean, that's the other side of the story, isn't it? Or not at all?
I think it's not at all.
Okay.
I think that's not true, I would say, because the fact that they were pretty much working as pretty much politicians at this point. They were kind of seen as a political party, part of Maduro's regime. Mm-hmm. That's how they have been portrayed so far. And now the population is asking them to kind of step in and do the right thing.
So we were looking at reports, like Reuters was reporting that some 4,000, I think, low and middle-ranked officers have already defected. That's according to a Reuters report. Is this not reaching critical mass yet to sway the loyalty of the military?
Well, I don't think yet, because most of the people that are deserted as soldiers, they're not generals. So you need the head of the military to desert to see a real change. But in any case, as he was saying, that's one of the main issues, to see how the military reacts. But it shouldn't be the only issue. We also need to take into account the social situation in the country, the social divide that we have. And even if the support to Maduro is falling, we still need a social division in whether or not to support the self-proclaimed new president.
Do you think Maduro has miscalculated his strategy on all this?
It seems so far that the military is staying loyal to Maduro, and I think we should remember that in a democracy we expect the state to have the monopoly of arms. We don't want to see a situation where half the army goes one way and half the army goes another way, because that will be a very different situation. So I think what we need to see is a peaceful transition to a government that everybody would support, whereas at the moment what we're seeing is two forces that are becoming more polarized, and that's a very dangerous situation.
That would probably exist in an ideal world, a peaceful transition, but that's not what we are seeing. And
I don't think we should talk up the risk of violence in somebody else's country. We see very clearly that Mogherini is trying to achieve a mediated settlement. Obviously, elections need to be part of that. It's a question at what stage elections are useful, because if you have elections very soon and you just end up with an extreme person who doesn't represent the whole country, that could be problematic as well. So I'm very supportive of the approach Mogherini's taken. She hasn't, although the European Parliament voted to recognise Guaido, the European External Action Service is not following that line, and they're trying to take a position of neutrality for mediation.
Because you signed a letter that Guaido was recognised a little too early.
Yes, my own fear is that if the European institutions are seen as going along with the US in supporting Guaido against the regime that's currently running the country, then they will no longer be able to act as honest broker.
Nelson, you wanted to interject earlier.
I don't think it's an issue between the US or the EU at this point. It's just the Venezuelan people want freedom. They just want, after 20 years of a regime that's been oppressing them, they just fed up. And they're living in the most poor conditions. A country that used to be the strongest country, economically speaking, in the entire hemisphere, and then suddenly now is in shames, completely destroyed. So we just want kind of freedom, as I was saying earlier.
Is that representative, though, of all? Because if I read reports or even talk to some of the journalists, they say that there's still ample support for Maduro, even from the people, because they don't like the idea of an unconstitutional change, let's say, of government.
Well, I think in terms of constitutional speaking, it is constitutional what we just seen. Who was unconstitutional was Maduro, because his term ended on the 10th. And then the president, the interim president Guaido, just took in as the Constitution mandates. So the Constitution speaking, he's on the right track.
But you don't expect to see a change of regime where somebody announces, oh, I'm the interim president. I know he was head of the Congress, but it's a rotating head, so he doesn't have a particular degree of authority. And then the US immediately recognises, and there was clearly an agreement beforehand that they would recognise. So that does not feel like a legitimate leader. But then I also agree that Maduro isn't a legitimate leader because the elections were clearly fixed and they didn't reach international standards. So neither of those are a solution.
At the same time, the Constitution gave Guaido 30 days to call elections. And that's what he intends to do. He wants to stay there enough so he can call elections, fair elections that can be monitored by the EU members.
We'll move on, but very quickly, I want you to react to, because you were reacting to what he was saying, that all Venezuelans want freedom. Can you just make a quick reaction to that?
I wanted to say that the position of the EU is not necessarily against that. It's actually the contrary. What the EU doesn't want to have is violence in the country. They are completely against any use of force in the country. They have said it today again, because what they are seeing is that the US is taking a very strong position, and the Guaido is aligned with that position, and they don't want violence in the country. They have supported a peaceful transition into a democratic solution. What they are doing is trying to align with several countries in the area and also in Europe to try to search for those elections to actually take place.
All right. This weekend, all eyes were on Venezuela and on the border. Now, the main foreign players on this crisis are, of course, we see the US, you have Russia, and they're locked in an information war. I mean, how this is presented, it's really quite interesting. Alex Morgan and our team at theCUBE have been looking into this part of the story. Alex.
Well, Tessa, there is a post going around on social media from a project called the Grey Zone Project. Now, that post claims to be offering a debunk of what you're seeing in the mainstream media, saying, actually, Venezuelans do have access to basic goods. There is aid coming from Nicolas Maduro, and things on the ground are not as you are seeing them. Why does it matter? Well, this post picked up and reshared by Russia Today, written up as a news article on their website, again, pushing a different narrative to what you might see on CNN is the source they named in their report, but what you might be seeing on other media. So what is going on here? Well, let's dive into this video, and it's by a journalist called Max Blumenthal, and he goes around this market, this state-subsidized market, goes to a bread stand, and he says this. This is the bread stand. It's really cheap. The large breads are being sold for 2,000 bolivars, less than $1. For me, it's basically free. And here, it's still well below market value. You can see the presentation of the situation that is trying to be made here. He goes on to give you other items. For example, ground chicken, 3,800 bolivar. He says more than affordable for people to go to these markets, subsidized by Maduro, and therefore it is wrong that foreign aid is needed. Venezuelans are dealing with it themselves. He doesn't deny there's a crisis, but denies the solutions coming from the West. However, is this a fair representation? No. Let me tell you why. First of all, the average monthly salary is 18,000 bolivars. That means that piece of bread is over 10% of the monthly minimum wage. Now, why does this matter? Because if you were to see this video, you were to see this article from Russia Today on their own, you'd be led to see a very different situation on the ground. And indeed, we showed this video to Venezuelans that we've been speaking to here in theCUBE and also asked them about their experience. Alvaro, he's a professor. He watched the video and he says people cannot buy bread every day at that price. You can maybe buy it once a week. And then this user here said that this bread, we asked him, is it affordable? He says hardly, because it's expensive, but people have to buy it because they need to eat. This is what people are saying. But there's nuance to this as well, because there is a perspective in the video which is important, and that's of a Venezuelan woman who says to the journalist there, we don't want foreigners getting involved. We're going to sort this out ourselves, saying all we want is the US to let off the sanctions. What you are seeing here is quite clearly a piece with a lot of spin. Yes, there are markets. Yes, there are Venezuelans there who don't want foreign interference. But no, these markets are not readily affordable to people. Basic goods are far more expensive than ordinary people can afford. So if you're seeing this kind of reporting, we urge you to view this and indeed the post from Russia Today with caution. Tessa.
All right, thank you for that, Alex, and our team in theCUBE. I'd like to ask you, as a Venezuelan, do you think there are a lot of people weighing into the Venezuelan story without actually understanding completely the? Because what do you think?
I think this is a perfect example of that. Like being Venezuelan, having family there, and knowing really what is happening on the ground. This is a perfect example. And thank you so much for bringing that in context. Because of course, $1 is just, as he says, is very cheap. But for a Venezuelan who earns in bolívares, $1 means a lot of money. And they cannot afford basic goods. Imagine that's bread, but imagine, for example, powdered milk for a baby, which is extremely expensive. They cannot afford. Same thing with like chicken or basic goods or medicine. Imagine medicine, which are people right now dying.
I mean, I think the important thing is just, context. I'll give you the last word there.
Well, I was really interested in the way he called that Russia Today piece, the person who produced it, a journalist, because I would say that's not journalism. Journalists stick to high standards. I mean, you're a journalist. You would check out your sources. You would make sure you balanced the piece. And I think we absolutely, as politicians, depend on high-quality journalism. And Russia Today is clearly not that. And I think that's why I very much value what you do. We can never know the country as you do, but as policymakers, we need to have clear information, and that's why journalism is very important.
Especially when we're watching a big story like this from the outside. I mean, not being inside. All right. And coming up on Raw Politics, a lot more. Enough is enough. That's what demonstrators in Romania are saying. A new government decision that limits the power of the judiciary prompted thousands to protest in Bucharest over the weekend. Can Brussels force Romania to get in line? That's next. Welcome back to Raw Politics. Thousands of Romanians took to the streets last night to protest against the government's controversial changes to judicial law. Critics say the new law will weaken both judicial independence and anti-corruption investigations. Prosecutors and judges have pledged to only work on emergency cases for up to 7 days, starting today in protest. The EU Commission previously expressed concern over Romania's attempts to change its justice laws, warning it could violate the bloc's rule of law standards, and warning that people have been wondering, will Romania be next in line for Article 7? All right, here with me in the studio to discuss this is Maltese MEP from the European People's Party, Roberta Metsola. Also joining us, Dan Luca, senior reporter, and still with me is Ryan Heath from Politico Europe. All right, I would like to ask, here we are again, in the same position, another country. Why does the EU keep getting back in this position?
Well, I think, first of all, the European Parliament should be at the forefront of making sure that rule of law is observed everywhere. In this institution, we have pushed for a mechanism that would test all member states every year, rather than picking and choosing where we have rule of law concerns. So, for example, last week in the Civil Liberties Committee, we voted on a resolution concerning those concerns in Malta and Slovakia. But in Romania, you have to admire the resilience of the citizens that are out in the street, have been out for over a year now to protest against their government's positions. This is democracy at work, both in Bucharest, but also in the European Parliament.
All right. So how do we look at this, Dan? I'm just going to say you are from a reporter from Euractiv. How do we look at this, that the EU keeps landing in this position and cannot get these countries in line?
Yes, thanks for the invitation. It's true what Roberta said. The country is alive, and you notice thousands of Romanians, not only in Bucharest, also in the other cities or either in Brussels, who protest, who express their views. It is opposition in Romania. We have debates now also in the Romanian parliament about this. Just to mention, to see the context, it's also a lot of lights on the Romanian, because we have the Romanian presidency, and also what is very important to understand, I don't say both parts, but to understand also how the government is seeing this, how the opposition and how the other parties, we know how is the projection here in the European Parliament. I suppose it's very important to know Romania is not like Poland, not like Hungary. It's a pro-European, it's a declared one, and they try to do it. And what they do now with the Romanian presidency, they confirm. And Timmermans was saying, I suppose last week, they do a great job, especially the permanent representation. He mentioned very clear, not the government, because he wants to show that it's a technical presidency and they deliver. And this is what we need to see what happened. Let's be very clear, Romania, it's under a monitoring mechanism since 11 years, and that's very important to clarify. Yeah. And there are these debates about justice laws, and still it's a debate about that. The implementation is in the Romanian parliament, and it's about opposition and pole of powers, what kind of law is better. But of course, I totally agree, European values and law just is very important.
Okay, I'm going to get to you, Ryan, but first I just want to bring up this map, because there's been growing concern over the rule of law in EU member states, especially in Eastern Europe. And here's a look at EU interventions the past 2 years. So Poland and Hungary have both had Article 7 triggered against them. General EU warnings over the rule of law have been lobbied against Romania the past year. And last week, Slovakia and Malta, as Roberta was mentioning, were called out over a failure to guarantee the safety of journalists. All right, Romania's prime minister also said that there seems to be a double standard coming from the EU. Is there a double standard when the EU seems to be stricter on certain countries?
I think the double standard was that the EU was happy to go after countries governed by conservative governments, and now the turn is the socialists. So what's common between Slovakia, Romania, and Malta? They're all run by socialist governments. So I don't think just because you have a so-called progressive or left-wing government in a country that you shouldn't be held to the same standard. So I do reject the idea that it's a double standard. I think it's the socialist countries that have been treated more leniently up until now. What is potentially valid is that a lot of these countries have developed their new laws, whether it's around media, judiciary, etc. They've pulled bits of laws from other Western European countries to create the new ones. Now, the effect is to have a big problem on rule of law, and it is not upholding the spirit of those original laws. However, they're not wrong. They were drawing upon other Western countries.
But what's interesting there is when they come up with these laws, I'll ask you, Roberta, because does it seem like they are emboldened or they are not afraid to pursue the line that they're pursuing? Because in the end, they know that the procedure is just so bogged down in here in Brussels, in the EU, that, you know what, it's fine. They can get away with it.
Yeah, but the easiest would be for us to give up, right? For us to say, look, these are principles that are enshrined in the treaty. They apply for every country trying to get into the European Union. Once you get in, they stop applying. This could be very easy for us to do, but I think we are a majority in this House that say no. If we see that the democracy and rule of law is under threat in one member state, then we're going to speak, irrespective of who is in government, irrespective of how let's say, emboldened their members representing those countries are in this parliament and attacking anybody, criticizing them. I mean, you can see a trend. You know, a country is attacked, then its MEPs decide to call others liars, traitors, etc. We need to stand for the rule of law everywhere. Now, it's up to us. And that's why sitting in the Civil Liberties Committee, as I do, looking at this week, for example, tomorrow we have a hearing on the European Public Prosecutor's Office, another Romanian candidate. What's going to happen there? Is the Romanian government going to continue acting like she's some kind of pariah? Because she stood up to corruption?
Yeah, and is it fair to say, though, that now the EU is, in general, is losing the battle against corruption? Is it fair to say that?
It's a very good point with the European prosecutors, because, as we know, it was a Romanian rapporteur, Monica Macovei, who initiated this. Now one of the Romania is the candidate. Will be a democratic procedure, and you know much better in the parliament how is to select its function, basically Romania. It's part of this game. Now, regarding the rule of laws, of course, there are different mechanisms. Now, what, for example, they said it's a correction, at least I quote from the Romanian government, a correction of a constitutional court decision from 2004 to clarify some legislation. Now, I don't know if it's exactly this or not, why it's very important what you say, to have a debate.
I'll give you the last word. I'll give the last word.
I think we know more about the problems now, and we care more about the problems. So it might look like a losing battle, but I think it's because a lot of people in Brussels weren't even paying attention up until the last few years.
And now they definitely
it's a struggle, but I think they are finally paying attention.
All right, and on that note, we'll end it there. Coming up in the program, is the EU losing the battle against corruption? Just as you were asking. Now, we want to hear what you think about that question. So do stick around in the next hour for your chance to call in and tell us what you think. Contact information is on your screen. The phone number is 00800 3333 7002, and email us at rawpoll@euronews.com. And join the debate on social media, Twitter, Facebook. Use the hashtag #RawPolitics. Our lines are open now after the break. Welcome back to Raw Politics. Now, we've heard from the politicians, and now we want to hear from you. Here are tonight's hot topics on tonight's Your Call. Playing chicken, running down the clock, even reckless. That's how some European leaders are describing Theresa May's Brexit strategy. She has delayed the meaningful vote on her withdrawal agreement till March 12, only 2 weeks before the UK is set to leave the European Union.
As we're continuing with those talks, we won't be bringing a meaningful vote back this week, but that will.
We want to know, is Theresa May a cunning or careless negotiator? Sharm offensive. EU and Arab leaders meet at a seaside resort in Egypt, but host Abdel Fattah el-Sisi comes with some baggage. After he recently authorized the torture and execution of 9 men accused of murder. Meanwhile, France is calling on Germany to loosen its arms export rules so it can sell more weapons to Saudi Arabia. As EU leaders embrace Middle East strongmen, is Europe selling out on human rights? Enough is enough. Public prosecutors in Romania are protesting a government decision that limits the power of the judiciary. This comes just days after Brussels hit back at Hungary for spreading misinformation about its migration policies. EU officials also have their eyes on Slovakia and Malta. But are they fighting a losing battle? Is the EU losing the battle against corruption? So these are the questions we're asking you. Is Theresa May a cunning or careless negotiator? Is the EU selling out on human rights? And is the EU losing the battle against corruption? And this is how you can get in touch with us. There are several ways to do so. All the contact information on your screen. You can call us for free at 00800 3333 7002. Send us an email at rawpaul@euronews.com or find us on social media and use the hashtag #RawPolitics. You can also look for us on Skype because we also want to see you. Now, joining me is our Brussels correspondent, Maeve McMahon. And still with us on the sofa, Roberta Metsola. She's an MEP, and Politico's Ryan Heath. All right, first of all, Maeve, you're going to be with me tonight on the Eurocall show. What are you excited about to hear from the audience tonight?
Well, the first question, I suppose, I'm very excited to hear from people about whether they think that Theresa May is a cunning or a careless negotiator, because, of course, the time is running down to the 29th of March. And now we thought that tomorrow that meaningful vote would take place, but it's been pushed down to sometime before the 12th of March. So that's one that I'll be watching tonight.
Yeah, and Ryan, you've been on the show as well.
Exactly. It's a lot of fun. Just call in. That's the problem sometimes with Europe. The way you make Europe work is actually having conversations with people outside of your own country, outside of your own town. So just take the chance and call in.
And when we ask, sensitive questions like that question about is Europe selling out on human rights, because Sisi was accused of a lot of human rights violations. So sensitive questions like that, we want to hear from you, What do you think? There's no topic off the table. And you, Roberta, you've also been on the show as well.
Yes,
what
absolutely.
Are you
I love
looking forward to?
And I love the fact that you have people who feel touched personally by the stories you're running. So people were calling in on our show, telling me, no, on that, I live in a town. This was about Brexit. It's being affected in that regard. Somebody from Malta called when I was on the show. So these are things that are really, people feel like they have another door into the European Parliament, and they can use the show to do that.
I think even with the other sensitive topic that we had on the show about, people just telling their personal stories. I think that's interesting as well.
And people always tell us that they feel they're not listened to, that politicians just do what they want and they never actually listen to and address their concerns. So this is why this show is amazing, to give people a chance to actually address those concerns, and then we can channel them in here to the European Parliament and make sure that politicians listen.
And for journalists, because we like to get, talk to the people that we write about.
It's so important now because Twitter, think about a forum like Twitter, it's getting very vicious. When you can actually have some sensible dialogue, and that's what takes place here on your call, then that's all the better.
Yeah, well, again, there's a lot of ways to get in touch with us. You won't be here tonight, Ryan and Roberta, but we will be here, Maeve and I. So you can get in touch with us. Call us for free at 00800 3333 7002. Email us at rawpaul@euronews.com, and also find us on social media, Twitter, Facebook, and use the hashtag #RawPolitics, or you can search for us on Skype. So all the details on your screen right now. All right, we do have some time left for tonight's Raw Moment, and it comes from the EU Arab League Summit, where Theresa May, she's been taking some cues from the Italian Prime Minister. Let's take a look.
You will have a lot of support. You have shown me how. Yeah, just like this, No,
The line is here.
If you put on the spot like that, what would you do if you didn't know how to play pool, but you had to?
I'm actually thanking God that I don't know a little bit about it. All those youth events when I was young, playing against guys who I was at school with, or girls who I was at school with. I'm hoping that they would come in handy in these situations.
At least it's just game, At least
we had a second-hand pool table when I was growing up, so I've got an unfair advantage in this sport. But I do think if you're going into politics, you've got to nail these things. You can't just be blind and live in your own bubble.
All right, thank you for joining us, and have a good evening.